Only in Kentucky can a single county be home to the world-famous trailhead, named after a Shawnee nickname for Daniel Boone, and a city once known by the colorful name of Yellow Dog before it was wired with some of the fastest fiber optic internet in the entire country. Hi, I'm Michael, and I'm learning a little bit more about Kentucky, one county at a time, all 120 of them. And today, I'm learning about Jackson County. If you haven't already done it, I do hope that you check out the other counties I've covered. As I've mentioned before, they're all listed in the playlist on my profile. If I haven't covered yours yet, I'll get to it soon, I promise. Jackson County is a landscape built on rugged, uncompromising verticality, sitting on the sharp, jagged edge of the Cumberland Plateau. This is the place where the mountains and the bluegrass blend, but that transition isn't a gentle one. It's a ridge and valley combination where the elevations climb from 600 feet in like the deep shaded creek bottoms to nearly 2,500 feet at the highest peaks. This massive elevation range creates distinct microclimates where the fog sits heavy in the hollows long after the ridges are bathed in sun. So historically, this terrain kind of, of course, dictated everything. It meant that if you wanted to build a home, you did it in the narrow hollows or along the thin strips of flat land by the creek valleys because the slopes were just simply too steep for anything else. Geologically, the county is a transition zone. It's a stack of shale, sandstone, and siltstone, but it is really the limestone that defines the northern part of the county. Because limestone is soluble, Jackson County is karst-prone. This means that the earth is essentially a honeycomb in that area. There's a subterranean world here of sinkholes, springs, and hidden chambers like Wind Cave near the Turkey Foot campground. Pardon me. When it rains here, the water doesn't just simply run off. It often disappears directly into the ground through sinking streams, traveling through invisible limestone conduits before emerging miles away as a cold spring. This geology is why the water here is so vital and also vulnerable. The county sits on a drainage divide feeding the middle fork of the Rockcastle River and eventually falling into both the Kentucky and Cumberland river systems. Long before any white hunter set foot in these hills, this was a landscape of high-stakes travel. Before the Long Hunters entered through the Cumberland Gap, there was the Warrior's Path. This wasn't just a trail, it was an ancient highway, a segment of a much larger network that stretched across the entire continent. It followed the natural avenues of least resistance, game paths carved into limestone over thousands of years by migrating herds of elk and buffalo. The path wound through the War Fork Creek area, acting as a connective corridor between the Shawnee spheres north of the Ohio River and the Cherokee settlements in the southern Appalachians. So imagine the tension on that path in the late 1700s. It was a corridor of diplomacy and a lot of conflict. But treaties like Fort Stanwix in 1768 and Camp Charlotte in 1774 were signed in faraway cities, but their effects were felt right there on the War Fork. These agreements often reflected the power politics of colonial empires and intertribal rivalries rather than any real control over the ground itself. It was this very instability that drew the Long Hunters like Colonel John Smith, who recorded his hunting expeditions here as early as 1766. These men were essentially scouts for a coming surge of settlement that would eventually fill in the creek valleys of what would become Jackson County. That surge took time. By 1825, families like the Lakes were documented accumulated land grants in the Lakes Creek Valley, but the county itself didn't exist officially until February 1858. It was the 106th county formed in the Commonwealth, carved from the edges of Madison, Estill, Owsley, Clay, Laurel, and Rockcastle. They named it for Andrew Jackson, the 7th president and the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. The county seat of McKee was established on April 25th, 1858. It was named for Judge George McKee, but if you talk to the families who have been there for generations, well, I read that they tell you that the judge's name came late. Before it was McKee, the little settlement along Indian Creek was known as Yellow Dog. It was a small, isolated node in a vast forest, a place where the records of the pre-county era were largely lost in a disaster in 1827. As you move through the county, you see the names of people who built in the hollows. Annville, the largest community today, started its life in 1878 with the name Chinquapin Rough. Pardon me if I said that wrong. It was named for the dwarf chestnut trees that grew thick and stunted along Pond Creek. It wasn't until 1886 that it was renamed for a resident named Nancy Ann Johnson. Over in Greyhawk, the post office had been open since 1853, named for the hawks that circled the limestone cliffs, or perhaps for the Gray and Hawk families who held the original land deeds. Economically, the history of Jackson County is a story of wrestling with the landscape. For over 50 years after the county was formed, the timber was virtually untouchable. The hills were too steep and the rivers were too unpredictable to move large-scale lumber. That changed in 1915 when the Rockcastle River Railway finally cut through the rock. This sparked a huge boom era. Lumber was hauled in massive sawmills in bond and shipped out to build the growing cities of the Midwest. In 1917, the first oil well was drilled near Sand Spring, and for a 2-decade window between 1920 and 1940, Jackson County was a hub of extraction and industry. But booms in Appalachia are often followed by silence. By 1932, the timber was depleted and the railroad was abandoned. After World War II, the mining declined and a massive outmigration began. Thousands of residents had to leave their family land to find work in the factories of the North. It was during this period of transition that one of the county's most incredible stories took place. In September of 1934, Sheriff Johnny Morris was attempting to arrest 2 suspects during a disturbance in Sand Gap. He was shot and killed in the line of duty, leaving the county without its lead lawman. In a move that made national headlines for its rarity, Judge John Davis appointed Johnny's widow, Sarah Jane Morris, to serve in his place. Sarah Jane did a little bit more than fill a seat. She ran for the office herself. On August 6, 1935, she became the first elected female sheriff of Jackson County. While the law was being settled, another kind of work was happening in Annville. In 1900, the Reformed Church in America sent missionaries to establish a settlement school. This became the Annville Institute. It was built on the philosophy of complete living, meaning they didn't just teach reading and writing, they taught the skills needed to survive and thrive in the mountains. They also taught plumbing, auto mechanics, weaving, and nursing. The campus became a landmark of the built environment. Their main classroom, Lincoln Hall, was a massive wooden structure that burned to the ground in 1921. But the community refused to let the mission die. They rebuilt it on the same foundations in 1922 using the local stone and timber, and it remains a historic district today, a testament to the persistence of Appalachian education. For a look at the more intimate side of the county's architecture, you have to find the Arthur Lakes log house near McKee. Built around 1890, it's a classic saddlebag style home. It was constructed using a specific hierarchy of timber. Oak logs on the bottom for strength and rot resistance, tulip poplar in the middle, and pine logs at the top to keep the weight manageable. The corners are held together with half dovetail notching, a technique that requires immense skill but creates a joint that actually gets tighter as the house settles. Now, the culture in Jackson County is defined by the deep memory of the Civil War. Every August, the county hosts the Battle of Big Hill reenactment. It commemorates an actual cavalry skirmish from 1862. A Confederate force was pushing toward Richmond and slammed into a smaller federal force here in the hills. The Cox-Simpson House, which still stands as of this video, was converted into a hospital where the floorboards were stained with the blood of soldiers from both sides. But the most surprising part of the Jackson County story is what is happening right now. For decades, this was one of the most isolated places in the country. But today, thanks to the People's Rural Telephone Cooperative, this one traffic light town has some of the fastest internet on the planet. They have wired the entire county with 100% fiber optic broadband. It is a jarring juxtaposition, if you ask me. You can stand on a ridge that looks exactly as it did when the Shawnee used the Warrior's Path, and yet you still have this gigabyte speeds that would make a Silicon Valley engineer jealous. This infrastructure has turned Jackson County into a certified gig community, allowing people to live deep in the hollows while still having the chance to work for global companies. Today, the county is home to about 13,000 people, 100% rural according to the census, and half of the land is part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. You can go to Flat Lick Falls and see the 28-foot drop into a limestone pool, or you can hike the Sheltowee Trace. The name Sheltowee was the Shawnee word for big turtle, the name given to Daniel Boone when he was adopted into the tribe. The trail runs right through the heart of McKee, making the town the center of one of the most important hiking corridors, and really one of my personal favorites in the eastern United States. So, that's Jackson County. What'd I get wrong this time?